Welcome to This Explainer. We constantly obsess over the morning routines of modern billionaires, right? We look at the reading lists of tech CEOs, always searching for that secret edge. But today, we're going to unpack the ultimate historical mentorship. When you picture Alexander the Great, you probably just imagine clashing swords and endless phalanxes. Yet the actual history tells a much deeper story. His meteoric rise wasn't just about physical strength, it was the result of a meticulously shaped mind. We're going to explore exactly how one of history's greatest philosophers engineered the intellect of its most ruthless conqueror. Okay, let's dive right into this. Imagine the crushing psychological burden of being handed the keys to an entire kingdom when you're just 20 years old. I mean, that's an age when most of us are barely figuring out our college majors. But for Alexander, this wasn't some peaceful, prosperous inheritance. No, this was a highly militarized state encircled by a ring of ambitious, opportunistic neighbors. They were basically circling like vultures, just waiting for a single moment of teenage weakness to tear his kingdom apart. And then, before you even turn 33, using that power to create one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. We're talking about a domain stretching all the way from Greece to the deserts of Egypt and the borders of India. But here's the thing. Stretching an empire like that isn't just a military feat. It's a colossal logistical and geographical puzzle. To march tens of thousands of men across unknown deserts and mountain ranges required a deeply scientific, analytical mind to solve problems on a scale literally no one had ever attempted. This staggering reality brings us to our central mystery today. How exactly does a 20-year-old pull that off? Brute force alone absolutely cannot hold an empire of that magnitude together. It demands strategy, a complete mastery of political optics, and a deep psychological edge over both your own generals and your sworn enemies. Where on earth does a kid get that kind of edge? Well, our story begins in 356 BCE in Pella, right inside a deeply intense psychological tug-of-war. Alexander's father, King Philip II, was a brutally pragmatic military genius. His mother, Olympias, was a mystic who fiercely believed her son was, quite literally, a demigod destined for absolute greatness. So young Alexander is the raw metal caught between his father's blood and dirt realism and his mother's mythic idealism. That is the exact raw material a master craftsman would eventually need to forge. Let's look at the timeline here and see how this builds, because it tracks a terrifyingly rapid ascent. We go from his birth, through a brief but intense period of elite education, straight to claiming the throne and crushing rebellions in just 2 short decades. He accomplished in 20 years what entire dynasties failed to achieve in centuries. It's a hyper-compressed timeline of execution. But long before he was leading armies and destroying cities, Alexander's raw, innate potential had to be proven. You have to remember that in ancient Macedon, intellectuals were often scoffed at. It was a rugged, anti-intellectual culture, where a future king couldn't just be smart. He had to prove his intelligence through sheer physical mastery. He had to show those battle-hardened veterans that he actually had the substance to back up his mother's wild prophecies. Now, what's really interesting here is the famous story of Bucephalus. Alexander displayed extraordinary intelligence by taming this massive, supposedly unrideable wild horse. But he didn't try to outmuscle the terrifying beast like the older men did. Instead, he used analytical observation. He deduced the horse wasn't inherently vicious, it was just terrified of its own shifting shadow. By calmly turning the animal to face the sun, he simply mounted it. It was a brilliant, youthful display that the mind could conquer what muscles simply could not. Witnessing this amazing display of intellect and courage led his father to make this very declaration. Philip essentially realized his kid was way too smart for their rugged provincial kingdom. Recognizing that he had a prodigy on his hands, Philip knew his son's mind required a much larger global stage, and you can't just send a kid like that to a standard tutor. To prepare him for that massive stage, Philip knew the boy's mind had to become a meticulously crafted weapon, which brings us to the master himself. Choosing Aristotle wasn't just about making Alexander smart. It was a deeply calculated political move by Philip to bind the intellectual heft of Greece directly to the Macedonian throne. He was fusing the ultimate thinker with the ultimate future doer. So the crucial point is that Aristotle wasn't just a basic tutor. He was the architect of Alexander's intellect, brought in to temper that raw courage into strategic brilliance. And the tuition fee for this unprecedented mentorship? It wasn't gold. To secure Aristotle, Philip actually agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which Philip himself had previously destroyed, and he even freed its enslaved citizens. That is how badly he wanted this philosopher to shape his son's mind. Looking at this curriculum, we see a program that shaped him perfectly. It was anything but theoretical. Aristotle didn't just lecture, he gave Alexander practical, tactical tools for world domination. For instance, he taught him advanced medicine, enabling Alexander to personally treat his own generals on the battlefield. And literature? Aristotle gifted him a highly annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander famously slept with under his pillow right next to a dagger. He was literally resting his head on a fusion of philosophical heroics and lethal force. But of course, all the medical knowledge and political theory in the world doesn't mean a thing until it's put to the ultimate test. And this immense intellectual tempering would soon face a sudden, unexpected, and entirely brutal crucible. In 336 BCE, King Philip II was assassinated. The transition of power was usually a total bloodbath, and abruptly, a 20-year-old philosopher's pupil found himself thrust onto the throne of Macedon, completely surrounded by battle-hardened wolves. It was time to see if the classroom lessons of logic could actually keep a young king alive. And this brilliantly illustrates the fatal mistake of his neighbors. While they foolishly expected a weak, grieving teenager they could easily rebel against, they were met instead by a stunningly fast, highly strategic military genius. Alexander used Aristotelian deduction. He realized instantly that hesitating for even a fraction of a second would mean absolute death. So he struck first, utilizing calculated precision to decisively crush the uprisings before they could even organize. Alexander didn't just defeat these early enemies, though. He clearly grasped the concept of hegemony, a political optics principle heavily analyzed by Greek philosophers. He understood that power is just as much about perception and narrative as it is about actual military force. He utilized his education to send a calculated, unforgettable message to the rest of the world. This culminated in the utter destruction of the rebellious city of Thebes. By leveling it, he proved his authority was unquestioned. This wasn't a temper tantrum. It was the ruthless application of political philosophy. Aristotle taught that a ruler must sometimes perform surgical violence to prevent wider, systemic chaos. By doing this, he proved that his philosophical training had indeed created an unstoppable tactical mind. As we conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. When you look at leaders today, are they relying merely on the brute force of their position or the strategic depth of their mind? Yes, Philip built the mighty Macedonian military machine, but it was the unparalleled strategic vision and unyielding logic forged in the classroom that allowed a 20-year-old to wield it across the entire globe. Looking at his incredibly calculated rise, did Philip's army conquer the world, or was it truly Aristotle's mind?